most people are serving time for violent offenses, and we need to reconcile with that and consider how we are going to address these more serious offenses and think about solutions and not just punishment. In that vein, 3, we must expand restorative justice practices. Our existing criminal justice system is punitive in nature, meaning that we punish people rather than looking at root causes, rather than focusing on healing and transformation of the individual and the victims and survivors of the offense. 4, we must end sentencing enhancements, including the 3 strikes law in California. Sentencing enhancements are meant to act as a deterrent for crime, but there is no evidence to suggest that sentencing enhancements have been effective. Our sentencing enhancement laws are so complicated that the average person is not familiar with them, so no one thinks, okay, let me not commit this offense because of penal code section blah, 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 blah. And in California, we actually have more sentencing enhancements than we have penal code violations on the books. And 5, we must ensure that people directly impacted by incarceration are leading these policy reforms. People directly impacted by incarceration are leaders in our own experiences. We are the ones who understand what we need to make our community safe because we know what we didn't have to end up in prison in the first place. And the first step in doing this is that we must restore voting rights to all people impacted by incarceration. Conclude with this. As a representative of an organization led by people directly impacted by incarceration who fight for policy change, I have witnessed many victories in decarceration policy in recent years. California is in the midst of a paradigm shift where our leaders are finally starting to realize that the punitive justice system and being tough on crime is not a cure for our social ills. As we move forward toward ending mass incarceration, we must expand on existing reforms and fight for bold and courageous change that is rooted in solutions rather than just punishment. Ending mass incarceration will require that we address these root causes of harm, shift our culture to one that embraces transformation, and follow the lead of those directly impacted by the criminal legal system. Thank you.
And thank you for the opportunity to appear before you in these hearings. My name is Charis Kubrin. I'm a professor of criminology, law, and society at the University of California, Irvine. And among other things, I research the impact of criminal justice reform, prison downsizing in particular, on crime rates. And I first got interested in criminal justice reform back in 2011 when I moved from DC to California to start my job at UC Irvine. It happened that realignment AB 109 had just been implemented. I knew absolutely nothing about realignment, but everywhere I turned, I heard dire predictions of an impending crime wave. And I came to learn that despite these grave concerns, there was no state funding set aside to evaluate realignment's impact, and that at that point, no studies had yet been done, so there was no evidence to weigh in on the issue one way or another. And I decided to do something about it. My colleague, Dr. Carol Ceron, and I received funding from the National Science Foundation to hold a workshop at UC Irvine, bringing together leading scholars who research prison downsizing throughout the country. And the workshop addressed essential questions, including, did realignment cause crime and recidivism rates to rise? Those who participated conducted original research. Those studies were peer-reviewed and published in a special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which Dr. Ceron and I co-edited. And our volume represents the first scientific, systematic analysis of realignment's impact. In the volume, Drs. Magnus Lofstrom and Steve Raphael conducted a study of statewide crime trends pre and post realignment. What they found was that realignment had no impact whatsoever on violent crime and only a very modest impact on property crime, and that was only for the crime of auto theft. They concluded the criminogenic consequences of realignment have been modest. Dr. Ceron and I worked hard to disseminate these findings. We published an op-ed in the Washington Post, we held a briefing in Sacramento, we spoke with reporters, we met with law enforcement officials, and during our outreach, something really interesting happened, which was that as we spoke about realignment and its impact, people wanted to know more about Prop 47, the newest reform that had been implemented, and what its impact on crime rates were throughout the state. Just like its predecessor, Prop 47 became heavily politicized. I saw the same alarming headlines in the news, Prop 47 causing a crime wave, for example. And the same situation with no funding set aside to evaluate it and no studies done at that time. One claim especially concerned me. Many people assume that if crime rates went up following Prop 47's implementation, that Prop 47 was to blame for those rising crime rates. But crime rates going up or down, for that matter, tell us nothing about the causes of those crime trends, whether they be up or down. Because crime is caused by a constellation of factors, not just a single policy. A proper evaluation is necessary to evaluate any policy's causal impact. This time I didn't wait for someone else to conduct the study. I did the research myself along with my graduate student, Bradley Bartos. Our goal was simply to examine the impact of Prop 47 on violent and property crimes statewide in the year following Prop 47's enactment, so 2015. We wanted to study Prop 47's impact on murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, and auto theft. So we did all of the UCR Part 1 crimes. And we utilized a research method that allowed us to construct a comparison unit that approximates California had it not enacted Prop 47. We call this synthetic California. Synthetic California is comprised of other states in the US that looked a lot like California in their crime trends prior to Prop 47 being implemented, but that did not implement a Prop 47 style intervention. What we were able to do in our study was compare crime in California in 2015 with crime in synthetic California in 2015, and any difference between the two time trends can be seen as the causal impact of Prop 47. So we really wanted to isolate the policy's impact. So what did we find? We found that Prop 47 had absolutely no impact whatsoever on the crimes of homicide, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, and burglary. We did find that Prop 47 might have caused a slight uptick in larceny and motor vehicle theft, however. But before we could conclude this was in fact the case, we needed to do what was called robustness checks on our data. And these are standard tests that are done in order to determine whether we might have issues of spuriousness in our study, like noise in our crime trends that could be accounting for these findings, and also to determine the extent to which our findings may be sensitive to our model specification. So if we created synthetic California differently, would we find different results? The robustness checks revealed that in fact the findings for both larceny and motor vehicle theft do not hold. So overall, we found very little evidence, almost no evidence, to suggest that Prop 47 had an impact on violent or property crime in the state of California following its enactment. These findings were published in the peer-reviewed journal Criminology and Public Policy, a leading journal in the field. So, what is the larger takeaway from both of these studies? Two things. First, we can downsize our prisons without harming public safety. We absolutely can. And secondly, that as other states throughout the nation debate prison downsizing and consider what reforms may work in their states, that California has to be front and center of that discussion. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank our witnesses, and we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'd like to ask unanimous consent of my colleagues to allow our 3 members who are here who are not on the committee to participate in Q&A.
Yes.
Thank you. And I'd also like to ask unanimous consent. I want to enter a document in from the Women Organizing Reentry Communities of Color. I'm beginning the Q&A by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So the Women Organizing Reentry Communities of Color have made a few recommendations. One, they want to make sure that we include gender at the onset of policy development, that we target resources for women of color to access employment and other streams of income, that we build data systems and collection into policies to promote transparency. And I'd like to ask if the Women Organizing Reentry Communities of Color, if you are here, if you could stand so we could acknowledge that you, thank you. Thank you very much for your input. You know, those of us from California, the two of us here on the panel, Representative Liu and I, are familiar with the propositions, but I wanted to know if, Mr. Romano, if you could please restate what were the significant aspects of Proposition 47?
So Proposition 47, which was enacted in 2014, took 6 common street-level crimes. We're talking petty theft, shoplifting, forgery, drug possession, and made those crimes mandatory misdemeanors rather than possible felonies. It made those changes both prospectively and retroactively, I think, which we all have discussed as an important aspect, meaning that future offenders could not receive felonies for those crimes, but also if you were in prison serving sentence for those crimes, and those crimes could amount to life sentences under the 3 strikes law, then you had an opportunity to get out. Proposition 47 also created a fund from the state savings from a reduced prison population and distributed that money to K through 12 education and reentry programs throughout the state.
And Ms. Cooper, and I know you were talking about Proposition 47, but could you please state for the record what was Proposition 36?
So I have not done research on Proposition 36, so I would defer to my colleagues who probably say more about that.
I would defer to Mr. Romano.
Oh, okay. Get it again.
So Proposition 36 was enacted in 2012. It reformed California's 3 strikes law to require the 3rd strike be a serious or violent felony. So in other words, you couldn't get a life sentence for a non-serious, non-violent crime. You limited life sentences for shoplifting a pair of socks, that's not an exaggeration, stealing $1 and change from a parked car, and like 47, it operated prospectively, meaning nobody could get a life sentence for these minor crimes in the future, but also retroactively. So if you were serving a life sentence for extraordinarily minor crime, you could get out of prison as well.
How about explaining what realignment is?
Sure. So AB 109 realignment was implemented in 2011. It took what we call the triple nons, the non-serious, non-sex, non-violent offenders, so very low-level individuals, and to transfer them from state-level prisons and down to the county level. Counties were given discretion and funding in which they could figure out what they wanted to do with these low-level offenders. They could put them in jails, they could do electronic monitoring, community supervision. Basically, each county had to come up with a realignment plan on how it was going to use its realignment dollars. The idea was that this was something that could be handled better locally, local solutions to issues, and also that this would save the state a lot of money because instead of having individuals in the state prisons at the tune of around $55,000 back then, that this would create a lot of savings for the state as well.
Thank you. And Ms. Vargas Edmond, you mentioned about how the state prison budget is still increasing in dollars, but has there been any increase in programming? Meaning education, training, etc.?
There has, so to technically answer your question, there has been an increase in funding for programming, but there have been many issues in terms of implementing and expanding access to programming inside of prisons, and there are various reasons for that. One, most of the prisons in California are rural. They're in places where community members who have to come in and offer their volunteer time to implement programs. It's difficult for volunteers to come. 2, there are security concerns. The way CDCR operates is if the prison is in a security lockdown, people are not allowed to move. I see that we're out of time, but there are various issues.
Well, in your last few seconds, it took community organizing and activism to really bring about these reforms. Could you speak a minute about that?
Yes, so community members, particularly people who are directly impacted by incarceration, recognize the importance of programming, and Proposition 57 was put on the ballot largely by the volunteer efforts of people who have incarcerated loved ones and folks who are formerly incarcerated, mostly because folks recognize that they want the opportunities to be able to come home and were willing to work and invest in their own rehabilitation in order to do so.
Thank you. Let me also just mention that for 3 strikes to change, there was an organization, Families Against 3 Strikes, that worked for a couple of decades to reform the 3 strikes law. Let me call on Representative Hank Johnson for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you hosting us out here in Los Angeles for this very important topic. I'm just heartened to see how many people in the community care enough about this subject to come out on a Saturday morning. And I'll note the vast array of ethnicities out there in the crowd. It's really heartening for me coming from Georgia, where we almost elected Stacey Abrams for governor. And we still have election theft going on around. But at any rate, what percentage of the petitions under Proposition 47, which was retroactive and which enabled persons who were currently serving sentences to petition the judge for release, what percentage of those petitions are granted and denied, or have been granted and denied? Granted or denied?
So both under Proposition 36 and 47, the vast majority have been granted. I'm saying, talking over 95% of people who are eligible have been released. I will say, however, the litigation is ongoing for both initiatives, especially here in Los Angeles, where prosecutors are opposing the release of these folks.
Mm-hmm. Have prosecutors, the prosecuting council, I guess, of California, have they opposed any of these propositions before they passed, and has their stance against the propositions, if there was opposition, changed since implementation?
So the California District Attorneys Association has opposed almost all of these reforms. Proposition 36 was supported by the Republican District Attorney of Los Angeles, Steve Cooley at the time, and the current District Attorney, Jackie Lacey. They are outliers, and very few DAs have recognized the effectiveness of these reforms.
What have been the human, societal, and or financial costs associated with over-incarceration? And anyone can respond.
I could be here all day talking about the human costs of mass incarceration. Maybe I'll share a little bit about my story of being a woman impacted by incarceration. My husband, at the age of 19, was facing 150 years to double life for an offense in which no one was hurt. He ended up being sentenced to 10 years and pled out to things that he did not do because of the ways the district attorneys have the ability to stack charges. Because of Proposition 57, he was able to earn almost 2 years off of his sentence, and that's the reason that he's here now. But the 7 years that he spent incarcerated cost me about $40,000 out of my pocket to be able to make visits, to be able to put money on the phone so I could talk to him, to send packages, and that doesn't even include the cost that we spent on an attorney trying to fight his case. There are too many stories that are exactly like mine, where women of color in particular bear the financial burden and the emotional burden and the social stigma of having incarcerated loved ones. So I think it's really important to take into consideration the human cost on not only the people who are incarcerated, but their family members and their communities who bear the brunt of that burden as well.
Children involved?
Children.
Can I just add, as a sociologist, someone trained in sociology, mass incarceration reproduces inequality in our society. It reproduces and deepens inequality in all aspects, whether we're talking about education, family, the labor market. Prison can be a stratifying institution. And so if we want to fight back against inequality, racial inequality in particular, we cannot have the kinds of incarceration rates that we have had in this country.
Even with Propositions 36, 47, and 57 and the legislation that you referred to, Professor Cooper, does California still have an over-incarceration problem?
Yes, we're currently at about 137% of the design capacity of prison system. We're under a federal court order that has ruled that the conditions in California prisons are so bad that they amount to cruel and unusual punishment. This was a decision that was originally made in 1995, and we are still under that decision. It was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 2011. We're still under that order, so the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Representative Liu.
Thank you. Let me first thank Congresswoman Karen Bass and my colleagues for being here for this important hearing, for all of you for being here. When I was in the California State Legislature, I had the honor of working with then Speaker Bass on her leadership team on criminal justice reform, and it's such a thrill to now be in Congress to work with Karen Bass on criminal justice reform. I've had the chance of visiting both federal and state prisons, and two things became clear to me. One is, regardless of what we think, we all agree on this one point, which is people in prison have a lot of time, and it seems totally ludicrous to me that we don't provide better opportunities for them to spend that time getting education or earning a skill or learning a trade craft. And the second thing that became clear is that with any large population, there is a large diverse array of interests. And some folks might love a plumbing course, want to be a plumber. Some folks might never ever want to go near that area. So my first question is to Ms. Vargas Edmond. You said the California Department of Corrections has a lot of discretion in implementing these rehabilitation credits. Do you believe they have enough array of programs for the diversity of interest that prisoners have in getting these credits?
No. Short answer, no. However, a positive aspect that came from Proposition 57 is that for the first time, incarcerated people were allowed to earn time off of their sentence for participation in what are referred to ILTACs, inmate leisure time activity groups, which are peer-led groups which are determined, based on the need and the interest of currently incarcerated people. So that's certainly a step in the right direction. But in terms of job or vocational training or rehabilitative programming that might address folks like cognitive or behavioral needs, I think a significant issue that we have is that currently incarcerated people don't have a say in which programs are implemented. What we've done with Initiate Justice is we've conducted surveys of currently incarcerated people to ask what programs they think should be available, and have been able to analyze some of those results and put forward recommendations when we advocate both through the legislature and through the administrative process through CDCR. I can't say that we have necessarily won any of those victories because it is a huge uphill battle, but I would recommend that the state legislature and CDCR actually ask folks who are impacted what they need to be successful.
Thank you. So there's one specific area that I've worked on. It's arts in corrections, and for some prisoners, going through programs related to art or through acting seems to have a transformative effect on them. I've worked with groups such as the Actors Gang, and they go in and they teach prisoners basically how to act. To me, it's really sort of an emotional management course, cloaked as acting, but it seems quite transformative. I've tried to get into federal prisons. Do they get credits for that, do you know, in Department of Corrections for arts and corrections programs?
Well, they could if the program was registered as an official inmate leisure time activity group. However, the threshold for that is pretty high. They are only able to earn 40 days off per year for 208 hours of program completion.
Thank you. Mr. Romano, Professor Romano, a question for you about Proposition 36. Based on the research I read, people who were released because of that have an extremely low recidivism rate on the order of 1.some%. Is that correct?
In the first year of their release, yes.
Okay. How about in the outer years?
And the outer years are still vastly outperforming all other people being released from prison.
What is the statewide recidivism rate in general?
Well, recidivism is a tricky word, but we can use returns to prison or new convictions. I think new convictions is probably the fairest and best measure. The statewide new conviction rate is about 50%, just under 50%.
So why is there such a huge disparity between people released under Proposition 36 and the statewide recidivism rate?
I should say the 50% recidivism rate is over 3 years, and I wish I knew the answer to that. Honestly, the recidivism rate for folks released under 36 has been better than our wildest expectations. We are very happy with the results. We have worked hard to ensure success for as many people as possible. Folks are older, but we're still outperforming old inmates who are being released. So there's a lot of reasons that go into it, and I wish I knew the answer.
Thank you. So let me just conclude with this. I want to thank all of you here for fighting for criminal justice reform. Many times things in politics seem impossible until it happens. So if 10 years ago I would tell you, hey, in 10 years we'd be smoking weed in multiple states, you think I was crazy? That's what's happening now, and then I yield back.
On that note, Representative Butterfield.
What a time to jump in. Let me just begin by thanking the three witnesses for your testimony this morning. It was a very profound presentation, and I want to thank you so very much. As Ms. Bass said at the outset of this proceeding, this is not a political rally. This is not a town hall meeting. This is an official congressional hearing. And so the remarks that you will make today will go into the congressional record and will be a guide for us as we legislate in the years to come. I am Congressman G.K. Butterfield. I represent a very low-income minority district in eastern North Carolina. Been in Congress now for 15 years, serving as Chief Deputy Whip of the House Democratic Caucus. What has not been made abundantly clear here this morning is that Congressman Karen Bass is a very busy congresswoman. We all know what her car looks like. It's a black Toyota with California tags on it. And we see that car all over Washington, D.C., morning, noon, and night. She represents you, and she represents you well. Y'all cutting into my time now. You're cutting into my time, but I've got to give... Please work with me. I've got to give credit for credit is due. And I'm not one that just heaps a whole lot of praise on people just for the sake of doing it. But your Congresswoman is a dynamic leader. Not only does she serve as the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism and Homeland Security, she is also the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, 55 members of us from all across the country. She was unanimously elected as chair of our caucus, and we are so very proud of her. Keep your applause down. She also serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee, where she leads the effort on Africa and world hunger and domestic poverty and all of the others. And so I want to just thank her publicly for her leadership. I also want to thank my friend Ted Lieu. Ted Lieu is a very active member of Congress. He is also in the Democratic leadership, serves as the co-chair of our Democratic Policy Communications component. I don't know, we call it the DPCC. He is very active. He's on the Judiciary Committee and serves you well. So I'm delighted to be here today. There are 240 Democratic members of the House of Representatives out of 435, which means that we are the majority party. We get enormous criticism all across the country because we don't tell our story well enough. And so this trip here to Los Angeles this morning is an opportunity for us to tell our story, to let you know what we're doing, to listen to you, and to collect information, collect evidence so that we can go back and do more. And so I want to thank you so very much for coming. In my prior life, I served as a judge. Spent 15 years in the judiciary in North Carolina, 13 of those on the trial bench, where I sentenced literally thousands of individuals over the 15-year period. I served on our state Supreme Court for 2 years. And so I have a vested interest in what we're talking about today. For 15 years, I sat on the front row watching justice and the miscarriage of justice take place right in front of me. And so though I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, I have a profound interest in this subject. Let me conclude by talking about my favorite subject on criminal justice reform, and it has to do with record expungement. Let us remember that 90% of those who are incarcerated are in state prisons. 10% are in federal prisons. What that also means is that we as a Congress do not have what is called jurisdiction over state issues. We cannot direct the states with respect to their criminal justice system. We don't have that power. We have the power of the purse. We can withhold funding to states for various programs, but we cannot direct states as to how to conduct their program. And so what I saw when I was a judge was that police at the time of arrest have the tendency to charge for offenses for which the defendant did not commit. Only just a hint that they may have been involved in it. And so what that means is that the overcharging is done so that when the case goes to court, there's room to plea bargain. There's the room for negotiation. And so if the young offender is charged with 12 offenses, when the case goes to court, the prosecutor may offer a plea deal for 2 offenses, which means that the 10 offenses would be dismissed. That sounds good, but it continues to be on the defendant's record for the rest of her life. It's a problem. And so when she's released from prison or terminates her probation, goes for a job, they look at the criminal record, oh, you cannot work here because you were charged with first-degree burglary. And when the defendant says, but that was dismissed, that does not matter to the employer. So please pay attention in California to the need for a strong expungement law so that cases that were dismissed and cases in which the defendant was found not guilty can be expunged from their criminal record. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. I too want to thank our chairperson in a lot of different ways. Obviously, as chair of this subcommittee, I'm really honored to be here, and as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. But I want to probe on something that was said, and I would like for you to elaborate on it. Front and center, you said something that I believe so go California, so go the rest of the nation. And I think that what you said, I don't put words in your mouth, but I want you to expound on it, the importance. Because in Pennsylvania, I've been around long enough to tell you that Pennsylvania went from 5,000 people in prison to 55,000 people in prison. And that Pennsylvania has 12 million people in the state. And the fact is, Pennsylvania is a rural state. And obviously, prison production has basically been economic development in rural areas. So we don't need to forget the fact that the economics around there. But I want you to probe, Professor, on that front and center statement, because people really don't understand on that part. Can you speak on that?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. California has led the way in many ways. At the same time, what California has done has been quite modest. I think the term low-hanging fruit was used, which is that we have identified the least serious offenders, right? The low-level, non-violent, non-serious, non-sex offenders. The big question to me, first of all, other states should be looking at California to replicate that, considering what may work in their state. But the next step is what's next? How do we continue on the path of reform in order to get where we should have been before the buildup started? And that's going to take some real digging, I think, to move beyond simply identifying the lowest level nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offenders. In some ways, I was not surprised by the findings of these studies because it is the low-hanging fruit that we're talking about here. People who have committed such minor offenses and would do better to have rehabilitation and other kinds of reentry responses rather than harsh punishment. The big question, I think, in California, but other states as well, is where do we go from here? What is next? California is a great first start. It should be modeled in many ways, but the next big question remains.
And I want to piggyback on, as a result of what you just said in Pennsylvania, the governor there did shut down a few prisons, and in addition to that, we passed the law on earned time, and we passed the law in Pennsylvania relating to closing cases so that that would be on the record. So I'm saying to you as our chairperson here, this is all being watched. I don't want you to just think you look at this from the perspective of California and Los Angeles, but you need to understand there are other states watching and listening. So you could not at a better time have the person who is chairperson of this subcommittee for the role that she plays, and along with Congressman Liu and Congressman Johnson, my good friend Congressman Butterfield said, but also say that Congressman Liu must be the best tweeter in the House of Representatives. He gives out lessons on that, and that social media is also extremely significant because you need to use every method in your toolbox in terms of communicating. So this hearing, in my view, reinforces this discussion, and that piece you said front and center, because states are the laboratory of democracy. It's not the national government. It really is driven from you, and then we react to what takes place in you. I was in the legislature for 36 years, and I was the chairman of the Appropriation Committee, so there's a direct connection to cost implications, which I think why you suddenly see Republicans, not because of moral outrage in my view, but because of the cost implications that it is driving on a national level, and each state budget is costly. So just understand the dollars are also driving the decision making of what is occurring here. And I just want to add that, and I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Representative Horsford.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I too want to commend you. The vision of your Congresswoman to bring these congressional hearings is very significant, as has been stated, and this is one in a series of congressional hearings across the country that is being led by Congresswoman Bass as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, so that we can hear directly from the community, the experts, those who are impacted by the policies that we are setting. And so I want to commend you again, Congresswoman, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I was looking up just quickly some information, and California spends about $75,000 a year to incarcerate a prisoner, and yet it spends about $10,000, $291 per child to educate. And so I want to ask the witnesses, what specifically, Ms. Edmond, what investments could be made on the front end to help strengthen our communities by supporting our programs around children, around families, that would help stem the issue of the incidents that lead people to crime to begin with?
Thank you very much for that question. I think a topic that is often left unaddressed in these policy reform conversations is root causes, so thank you very much for that. First and foremost, I think that we should, directly be asking people who are impacted, what services could have been in place to prevent you from committing what it was that you committed. I think that what we would find are things that we know a little bit already. What causes violence? We have an incredibly violent culture. We have a history of racism. We have poverty. We have issues of unaddressed mental illness and substance abuse. So those are some areas where we can start. I think most folks in our communities are aware of the fact that if you're experiencing a mental health crisis, you do not have access to resources or social workers, and what folks will often say is, well, we have to wait for them to commit a crime and then we can call the police. I'm glad that you raised the amount that we spend on education. I think what we're seeing is that we get what we pay for, so I believe that we need to dramatically increase what we're spending on social services, ensuring that children who are in crisis are getting care that they need, that everybody has access to therapy to work through trauma that they have that may cause them to cause harm in the first place. And if folks do end up being incarcerated, making sure that we are seriously and significantly investing in their own healing and transformation and reentry.
Thank you. I want to ask the witnesses to discuss the juvenile offender piece of this. You have described the California legislature's steps in recent years acknowledge that age should be taken into consideration when determining the length of a person's incarceration. So what things should we consider as federal legislators in approaching or reforming some of our practices around juveniles?
I would recommend looking at the science. There's a lot of evidence to show how cognitive development is different for different folks. So looking at what the different cognitive needs are for people who are below a certain age and coming up with appropriate responses based on what the cognitive development is for the person at that age. And then, just to reiterate the point that I made previously is to increase access to programs and services so that folks who are young have access to maybe more like non-punitive interventions. I think, most young folks make mistakes. Some are illegal, some are not. Some people get caught, some people don't, and a lot of that has to do with your income and your skin color. So taking into consideration what we can do to target specifically vulnerable young people and make sure that they get care and not just punishment.
And finally, Mr. Romano, real quickly, on the recidivism rate, you said about 50%. How much of that are for technical violations, and how is that being addressed in any of your policies?
Those are for new crimes. So those are actual convictions.
So, but my understanding though is if you technically violate off of a minor offense, you can end up back in prison.
Actually, California was one of the first reforms that California achieved was to reduce, if not fully eliminate, returning people back to prisons for technical rule violations. So both for parole, which is run by the state, and probation, California dramatically reduced the number of people who are going back to prison for technical violations of their release rather than committing new crimes. It was one of the first and most successful reforms.
Can I get the information on what that is? Because we need to bring that to Nevada.
Absolutely.
Well, once again, I want to thank our witnesses for our first panel. This was excellent. We really appreciated your testimony. And as my colleague, Representative Butterfield, said, you're not just giving testimony and having a discussion here just to educate ourselves. We take this information and this absolutely helps us develop legislation. So thank you very, very much. While we are transitioning to the next panel, I wanted to acknowledge a few people that are here. I saw former Assemblywoman Gwen Moore come in. Where is she? Please stand up. That's for my colleagues here, that's the other Gwen Moore. There is a member of Congress named Gwen Moore who is from the great state of Wisconsin, but she's the original Gwen Moore in our audience here. Michael Lawson, who is the CEO of the Urban League, is here. Standing next to him is Pastor Michael Eagle, who has also been a warrior for criminal justice reform for many years. And I want to thank Reverend Boyd. Those folks from Los Angeles know we are in the famed Renaissance Center. We are across the street from First AME Church, so we want to thank Reverend Boyd. I see our MTA Commissioner, Jackie DuPont Walker, who is here. Now let me welcome our second panel. Our first panel talked about reforms that California has done, and our second panel is going to look at what happens when people are released from prison. What do they need? What is their journey? And what can we do legislatively to help? I want to mention that on Tuesday, the Crime Subcommittee in Washington, D.C. is going to have a hearing that is specifically looking at women in the criminal justice system, because as we embark on criminal justice reform in our nation, I have been struck by the fact that the discussions really are talking about men, and women and children are often not a part of the discussion. So I want you to know that that is not the case in Washington, D.C., but we are definitely going to look at that. And then also, you know, the fact that we are here today having this hearing, I think it's an example of the types of things that we can do now that things have changed somewhat in Washington. We need to have further changes over the next year, but the changes that have already taken place result in being able to have hearings and putting issues like criminal justice reform seriously on the top of our agenda. So, our first panelist, Susan Burton. She's not well known in Los Angeles. She is founder of a New Way of Life Reentry Project. The project promotes healing, power, and opportunity for formerly incarcerated people by taking a multifaceted approach to mitigating the effects of and ultimately eliminating mass incarceration. The project provides housing and legal assistance and other comprehensive services for those coming home after incarceration. And people might remember that Susan Burton was one of the first recipients of the CNN Heroes. She was one of the 10 finalists out of the thousands around the country. Mr. John Harrell, as I know him, I'm used to calling him Big John, Big John is a diversity management superintendent with the Los Angeles Electrical Contracting Companies, who's an electrician, works with individuals who seek a new direction in their lives through the construction trades with Second Call, Second Chance, and Loving Life. Second Call is a community-based organization designed to save lives by reducing violence and assisting in the personal development of high-risk individuals and those who have suffered convictions and incarceration. Mr. Stanley Bailey will describe his experience having been sentenced to life in prison under California's 3 strikes law for a non-violent offense, and his later release after the passage of Proposition 36. Bailey also gave back after his release and drove across the country with a program that provides rides homes to those leaving incarceration. We welcome our second panel and thank them for participating in today's hearing. I will remind the witnesses that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes, and to help you stay within that time, we will continue with our iPad screen, which has your time. Ms. Burton.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Bass, for putting this panel together. And I want to thank you all for spending your Saturday morning with us here in Los Angeles. My name is Susan Burton. I'm founder of a New Way of Life Reentry Project. And just to give you some context of how I got here, which is documented in the book that you all have. The short story is, I lost a son. After I lost him, I began to drink. I drank alcoholically, it escalated drug use, and I was sentenced to prison. I was sentenced to prison not 1 time, but 6 times. Every time I would plead my case and ask for a judge for help, I was always sentenced to prison. October 4th of 1997, I found a place on the west side, Santa Monica, out by the beach, that helped me. When I landed there, I couldn't understand why the type of help that was available to people in Santa Monica was not available to people in South LA. After leaving the recovery program, I worked, I saved money all the time, beginning to understand the difference of the 2 worlds. And I saved money and I got a little house. You're going down to Skid Row today. You'll see where we get off the bus when we come from California prisons and try to make a way back into our lives. I met Karen Bass at the Community Coalition, one of the only places that embraced what I was doing. I bought a house and I began to meet women down there at that bus station and would bring them to that house. Today, that was 1998. we've helped over 1,000 women come back into the community. We have a 90% success rate. We also help women reunite with their children. We have legal services. We have just an array of services. I published a book in 2017. 2018, I spent going to prisons all over this country and in 2 other countries. I visited 30 prisons. I visited 30 states, 46 prisons, and sat down with women. And when we talk about what women need when they are leaving prisons, overwhelmingly I saw people recidivating because they had no safe place to go. I saw women who were desperately trying to maintain their parental rights when needing reunification services and ways to keep ties to their children. I saw women who wanted to get a job and go to work and were worried about how they would employ, how they would get employed, how they would live. As a result of that tour, as a result of seeing all the languishing and suffering women across this nation, I developed a training to help states to replicate our model at a new way of life that has proven to be very successful. I've also raised $2 million to help those states and those women to replicate the model of a new way of life. I know what it could mean to leave a prison and have safety, and to leave a prison and not have safety. Women are the fastest growing segment of the prison system, and we could really be doing something different. So I'm really, really thankful to you, Congresswoman Bass, for holding this hearing, not town hall, and having us come together here to begin to discuss women reentry and the needs to turn the tide here. Before I close with my 11 seconds, in order for me to go back home to a new way of life, I need to have all the women from a new way of life stand. And I'd really like to have all the people in the audience who are formerly incarcerated. Can you just stand and let us know and see who you are and what you look like? All right. Thank you, but I think housing, jobs, reunification supports, and just being able to have that level of hope for people coming home. Thanks.
Thank you very much. John Burrell.
Thank you. That's a tough act to follow right there. I just want to say thank you for the work that you do, Susan, because I'm aware of it. And thank you, Chairman Bass and the committee for being down here. This is a great day today, and I'm glad to be here. So as you read off my things that I do as being a IBEW union electrician going into my 22nd year, diversity manager, general superintendent for Moore Metals Corporation, and a facilitator at Second Call, and also a member of the great Abundant Life Christian Church down on 3500 South Normandie, where we hold the life skills class every Thursday. But before we get to that, of me being a homeowner, an individual in the community that still lives in the same community that I helped destroy, let's go back to the prison system, because absolutely I come from a dysfunction. I did not know that I had low self-esteem growing up. When I would suit up, and when I say suit up, we're talking about not the suit that I have on today, looking real handsome. The other suits that would cause individuals to say, hey, that guy must be a member of so-and-so. I had no idea that I wanted to commit suicide. I just didn't want to do it by my hands. I wanted somebody else to do it. So growing up in my community, when I think back of there was no men leading the way as far as getting up, putting their boots on, going to work every day. What I saw in young men were other things that were counterproductive of manhood, but at the time I didn't know. To go to show you how counterproductive it was, I can remember a time as a young man, you know, my mother, bless her soul, she's not here anymore, but I can remember her being on the floor, picking up little white spots thinking it was crack cocaine. And my sister was involved with the man who supplied her the cocaine, and I worked for him as a drug dealer. So he was able to take control of the whole household. But by me not understanding manhood, I thought it was just, that's just how it was. I had visions of going to prison because in my community, prison was rewarded. Now that I know that it's not like that, when I got out, it was when I was in prison, it was two men by the name of Ernest Corns and Everett L. Timms that helped me see something in myself I didn't see in others. I didn't see in myself. So when I got out of prison, the IBEW saved my life, and More Metals enhanced it because they believed in a young man that did the things that I've done with these same hands. Everything in LA that's built of significance, I've been on to help build. So with that, I understood that if it helped me, I had a duty in my community to help those same young men and women who others would call gang members, I call them friends. We are in the same group of now picking up tape measures instead of guns, purchasing homes instead of doing home invasions, but it was all through the fact of we had life skills, and that's what Second Call does, the life skills. So we talk about the anger management, the low self-esteem. How did it feel for me not to have my father, my mother even hug me and tell me she loved me? How did that make me feel? So when I talk about those things and I get that out of me free of charge, we get to talk about that once a week down there on Thursday. It makes me a better person in my community. And it makes me a better employee, a better friend, a better father, a better grandfather, and an individual who can change and save lives because of the simple fact of what we preach and teach is, I want you to be a better person. The careers come later. There is nothing I cannot build due to the building trades, allowing someone like me with a background, a 9th grade education, now there's nothing I cannot build. I am an absolute vicious individual when it comes to being a building electrician. I know how to do this, and I thank the More Metals Corporation and the family because with them, from the top down, that family decided to come out and invest in our community. And there's a lot of young men and women are working because the IBEW provided the platform, but More Metals enhanced it by allowing them to come down and see what Second Call does and embrace what we're doing for the community and help us be productive citizens in our community. So with that, I'll say to you, thank you for thinking outside the box and being uncomfortable and coming down to the community and doing something different. Thank you.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here. As mentioned in the bio, I did do 36 years in the California Department of Corrections, long before they added the R and to it to make it rehabilitation. What's not mentioned is that when you get a significant amount of time, you're sent to a prison of a higher security. So the programs that help you earn your way out are not available because of the constraints for safety. You're not allowed to roam free in and out of your cells for evening classes, and it makes it hard to participate in classes. My childhood, to go to that, is pretty typical. I was involved in drugs. 2 months before my 19th birthday, I entered the prison system. A month before my 54th birthday, I was released. I was a recipient of Prop 36. 20 years in the prison system. I was convicted of drug paraphernalia, which triggered the 3 strikes. life sentence. During the last 10 years of that sentence, I availed myself to self-help classes, alternative to violence programs, Criminal and Gang Members Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I didn't enter the prison system as a thug, I went in as an addict, and there is a big difference. Addiction and mental health make up a large proportion of the prison system. The mental health people that suffer are abused both by other inmates and staff. Addiction was not addressed. Ill tag was not even a word when I went into the system. After Prop 36 passed, I was picked up by Stanford's Right Home program with one of the two individuals that weren't attorneys that were released from prison, convicted felons themselves. And the first 24 hours of release was a real crucial time for me, and having some instruction of what I could expect to come my way, both good and bad, given firsthand. Not somebody that spoke about it academically, but someone that had actually done it, was a big help. And if you serve a significant amount of time, housing and employment is the issue. Most young men that go in and women and do 18 months, they still have family, they still have girlfriends, boyfriends, people to look out for them when they get out. If you serve 10, 20, 30, 40 years, when you become that age, the generation before you has most likely passed. Myself, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, everybody passed before my release. When I was getting ready to come home, everybody that I knew was a junkie or a thug. So to come out to that was a scary thought. And I was approached by my counsel, who works for Stanford University, and I was told to maybe that volunteering for transitional housing. It wasn't court ordered in for Prop 36 recipients. And also for AB 109, under the post-release community supervision, was another good thing to volunteer for. You know, it gave you accountability. Transitional housing is just what it says. And if you serve 3 decades in prison, you need a transition back to society. Most of us know where China is. Most of us know what a boat is. But if you take us down to the dock and you say, get in a boat and go to China, you're kind of at a loss. Even if they hand you charts, you don't know how to navigate that. And that's what we deal with as older people coming out of the Department of Corrections. Since my release, I've worked as a street sweeper on the Figueroa corridor from Martin Luther King to Adams. I passed by there today and it was kind of ironic. And since I'm now a heavy equipment operator and a truck driver, when I tell people that I work for Christmas as a street sweeper, they assume it was machinery. And I tell them, no, it's like the guy following the elephant at the zoo. You know, I had a little cart, you know, from the business to the curb, you know, and that's what I did. And when I'd ride the bus to work, I'd pass a little truck yard. And I always thought, I'm gonna go in there and ask that guy if I can, you know, get some experience around those trucks. But he had this dog that used to run out to the front and chase me. So one day I got up the nerve and I went in there and I told the gentleman, man, I'd really like to have some access to the trucks and the heavy equipment, just to familiarize myself with it. And he was like, well, don't they have classes for that? And, you know, and I tell him, hey, you know what, I need it. I learn by touching, by doing, not by reading about it. And whatever you need, I'll give you 10 free hours of labor work a week, and I'll even pick up after that little raggedy dog. You know, whatever you need, you know. And luckily he didn't chase me off and allow that. And while I was in the transitional housing, I acquired my commercial license, and I'm now working as a commercial driver and heavy equipment operator. I just want to emphasize how important transitional housing is. It should be mandatory. It shouldn't be a volunteer thing that after you serve your sentence, you can go. It should be 2 years before your sentence ever ends. Would you like to go? And give a chance to transition back into society and get some, like John mentioned, get some man skills or some woman skills, get some job training. And transitional housing shouldn't be another prison. It should be a place to transition into society.
Thank you.
And my time's up, and I just want to thank you for your work on my behalf. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. One, I really appreciate all of your testimony, and what I wanted to focus on, I'm trying to develop a piece of legislation, which you're very familiar with, to come up with reentry services. And I know in Los Angeles, we just opened a reentry center that I'm very excited about visiting. I haven't visited yet. I know under Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, and it's right near here, and I think it opened up maybe just a week or two ago. So I'm interested in developing a program that would be run by formerly incarcerated people. Big John, I've been to your meetings at Second Call, and I will never forget going there and listening to people tell their stories. But if you could envision a program, a one-stop center for people when they get out of prison, and you all do a piece of that, what should take place in that one-stop center? What is needed? And Mr. Bailey, your testimony, which I know I never thought about until you mentioned it, somebody that has been incarcerated for a long time and their family passes away. I never thought about that, but then again, it's so hard to envision the amount of time people actually serve. You said your final strike was drug paraphernalia. What did you have that sent you in for life?
I had a hypodermic syringe in my cell.
A hypodermic syringe in your cell led to life imprisonment.
Yeah, it triggered a non-violent, under the old 3 strikes law. That was my 3rd strike, and it triggered a life sentence.
Incredible. So what would you do, Big John? What would you do, Ms. Burton?
Well, for me,
What do you need in a program?
the first thing I would do if I had a one-stop,
Right.
I would form the relationships with all of the building trades and
Okay.
sit them in a room and come up with a process that might be just a little bit different than what the normal process is, because we know we're dealing with certain circumstances, to help facilitate the process of a young man or woman getting into the trades. Because oftentimes people will walk by and say, hey, I don't see no black people, I don't see no women. And it's not because they don't want to get you, it's the fact that I don't know the rules. Like, I have to have a high school diploma. I have to be drug free. I have to take an exam. And then when I get to work, this is where these life skills come in at. Do I show up 2 hours early, or do I show up 2 minutes late? Do I walk with a purpose, or do I just go out there and lollygag and think? And that's why it's so important to understand those dynamics.
So in a one-stop, would you have like GED training?
Yes.
Would you have, and speak a little bit more, why the building trades?
The building trades, because I'll have a career. The difference between a building trades and a job is that a job maybe afford me a 1-bedroom, a career will give me a house to where I can get into the living in my community and doing what I'm supposed to do and provide a way. I have a pension, I have health care, and I can build things, and I can leave a legacy, because I'm the first generation in my family bloodline to be a part of a union. And I know that the building trades treats individuals who follow and do what they're supposed to do with respect, with pay, and they can take care of their families.
And the building trades is one of the few areas that actually welcome people who are
It doesn't matter about the fact. I have individuals who have done 38, 40 years, 25 years, 8, and I'm talking about the proven risk. I'm not talking about the at risk. I'm not talking about low-level crimes. I'm talking about absolute top, apex, vicious individuals, the ones who are the proven. Those individuals now are working on projects because of the building trades and coming down with the life skills. I have blacks, Latinos, whites, Asians who want to change this, and we help them, and they get out there in the field and they are thriving. They're building the Ram stadiums, the hospitals, the Staples Centers. We are doing that work. The individuals who used to use these hands for wrong are now doing it for right.
Ms. Burden, what would you put in a one-stop?
So Congresswoman Bass, to have a one-stop is just like kind of like common sense for us to be able to go one place, get your ID, apply for benefits, get connected to medical services, go to have a GED class, go to have family reunification. We're located in the one-stop. So a new way of life is a part of that. We're doing family reunification, to have child services in that one stop. But to have an array of services allows people to begin to get their lives on track quicker, faster. I said to one of the residents a couple of weeks ago, I said, "What are you doing today?" And she says, "Well, I'm going to apply for the rehabilitation services." And I said, "What else?" And she said, "That's all I can do with the transportation." But having a one-stop allows people to access all the different services in one place at one time that can bring their lives back together, that they can move forward.
Do you think people who are formerly incarcerated could run a program like that?
Of course. Hey, I'm doing national and international reentry. You know, a new way of life has built a place in Uganda, okay? We're about to do one in Kenya. We have a shop going up in Chicago next month, one in New Orleans later this year. Can we? All we need is opportunity.
Thank you.
All we need is opportunity.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Hank Johnson. I represent Georgia's 4th District, which is the eastern suburbs of Atlanta. And I've been in Congress for 13 years. Before I came to Congress, I was a criminal defense lawyer for 27 years. And I remember every bit of that 27 years, but thinking about 36 years that you did, Mr. Bailey, is almost unfathomable to me, that. And I tell you, it's not often that people out in society who are, quote, law-abiding citizens, it's not often that they would get an opportunity to hear the kind of stories that you three have told us, and what you have overcome, what you have accomplished, is indeed maybe not the same American dream that others have fulfilled, but certainly you're living what has to be an American dream, and I want to congratulate all three of you all for your accomplishments. And since everybody is talking about Karen Bass, let me say that you know, during that first 12 years, I was just a rank and file member of the Congressional Black Caucus, never had the desire to serve as an officer, but now I serve as the secretary of that organization. And the only reason why I did that was so that I could support Karen Bass as president. Well, I'll be her attorney general. But let me ask this question in all seriousness. What is the typical experience of one who has completed their time, they're walked from their cell to the to whatever outtake location it is at the prison? What takes place for the typical inmate at that time and thereafter, the first 24 hours or so? Could you all?
I can speak on that. I've done it a couple of times. You leave your cell, usually you give away all your stuff to people that you know and people that are in need. You go to a receiving and release area. You're fingerprinted. Your property is searched on your way out. You're given $200 at the gate, and then you're escorted to the parking lot. Excuse me, let me back up. If you don't have clothes to parole in, then about $30 or $40 of that $200 is taken from you to supply you with dress-out clothes. If you're in a rural area that doesn't really want convicted felons released in their backyard, then there's a shuttle service that takes another $80 from you to get you to a larger metropolitan area to put you on a bus back to home. So, you know, now you're down to about $90 when you hit the streets, and you're told that within 24 hours you need to report to your parole agent or it's a violation of the conditions of your parole. Without transitional housing, it's a really scary experience. And there's very little support. The guards in receiving and release say, hey, we'll see you in a couple weeks. You know, and that's usually the way it works too. Recidivism is ridiculous, and it's hard to navigate it without transitional housing. I keep going back to that. I benefited from it. I spent 15 months, 9 of it voluntarily, court ordered for 6, and it was immeasurable for me into what success I've had.
Thank you.
So 10 days before release, they dropped you, and I can remember a paper being dropped through the wicket, and they call it S-time ducking. 10 days before you release, the anxiety sets in because you know you're unprepared and you know you have nowhere to go. The morning of your release, you wrap up all your bedding, your clothing, you take it to the gate, you yell up to the gun tower, I'm being released. You walk over to R&R. You're stripped out just like you're stripped in, and you're fingerprinted out. You're given an envelope when you're ready to walk through the gates after 3 or 4 hours of sitting there sweating, full of anxiety. They give you an envelope. They put you in a van. They drive you to the bus station where you buy a ticket. You ride from whichever prison in California you're being released to, and you get off the bus downtown Skid Row. When you're down there, just think about how many people are being paroled back there and have to leave through that muck and mire, through the devastation, through the conditions to find their way. You're hoping and you're praying for something different. You know that something different is in you, but you just don't know how to access it. And all of these emotions and your freedom and the ability to make a decision is all coming back to you. And 6 times I did that. 6 times I failed. It wasn't until I accessed support that I was able to get my life back together. So no one should be released to those types of conditions and not have to and have to navigate that.
What I find so disrespectful is the fact that I had to do it 3 times. But the thing that I found just so disrespectful is the fact that it's almost like taking a shower, getting really clean, and then putting dirty clothes back on. Because what happens is they release me and they send me back to my community. But then when I go to the parole officer, they tell me I can't be associated with gang members. Well, wait a minute, this is my community. These are my friends. Do you want to violate me but send me back to the same community? I have nowhere else to go. So now, by me being an electrician and doing what I'm doing, the very house where it was the epicenter of the nonsense is now about to be a house for transitional housing once it gets completed when it's remodeled to give back to the community and help so it just doesn't happen to other people.
Representative Liu.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your stories and the great work that you've done. Ms. Burton, I'm curious, the last time that you were released, how did you find out about that support? What caused you to make a change related to the prior 6 times? And how did you know about that?
So I reached a place that emotionally, spiritually, that I knew if I didn't get help, I would die. And over a cheap, it's in the book, over a cheap beer with a friend, he told me about this place in Santa Monica that he had been. it didn't dawn on me that it wasn't working for him because we were drinking cheap beer. But I was desperate. I was desperate to find some type of help. And I made my way there, and that's what turned it all around. My parole agents, law enforcement, no one ever offered anything that would help me. I would say that, they never picked me for nothing good. But I finally arrived there, and that turned my life. And there was therapy services. I was introduced to AA. I'm 21 years sober. Dental services, medical services, clothing, food, everything I needed was there for me to begin to heal, because that's what I needed to do, was heal.
Thank you. Mr. Harriet, you said that they sent you back to your community. Could you have gone anywhere, or did they restrict places you can go after you leave prison?
I could have went anywhere, but my money, I only had $200. $200 got me back to the community I left from. I couldn't go anywhere else because that stuff got to be approved. And if I don't know no one, all I know is my community, because that's what birthed me and made me. So I had to go back to the nonsense. And it's almost like it's a catch-22, because in 24 hours I got to go in front of the agent, and then they give you all these rules. And I'm sitting there like, wow. So I figured out that, wait a minute, if the trade saved my life, then I can do the same thing in my community. So a lot of young men that's from my same community are working now, because I didn't leave the community. I changed my thought process and actually doing the work, and I became uncomfortable by talking to individuals who I normally wouldn't talk to, and asked them, I can help you if I'm willing to change, and I'm willing to go down and do the necessary work to change this community. I don't want to leave my community. I just want to enhance it and make it just like anybody else.
And how did you find out about the trades?
While I was in prison, after it was, like I said, there was some men in there. One of the gentlemen was an IBW electrician. I never thought about it. I only thought it was for white men and dudes in the mob. I never thought they would accept someone that looks like me. But this individual, when I was in prison, I had about 1.5 years to go. And I had to change some ways, and that's where those life skills came in. And I started to understand that, make no mistake about it, I'm not sitting there telling you that the police put something, no, I did what I did, and I went to prison for it. And I had to accept that fact, be responsible, and then I had to figure out a way how to change that when I got, and it started while I was in prison. I started getting up, going to work every day in there, because those men helped me, and then when I got out, I just took that same energy, brought it out, and helped other people that want to help also.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, you mentioned Stanford's Right Home program. I had not heard of it until you mentioned it, so I just read about it. And it's a pretty startling statistic that they have on their website. Says that in the first week after release, prisoners have a 12 times higher chance of dying in their very first week. So I'm curious, if the Right Home program wasn't there, what would you have done when you were released?
Well, I had been paired through an attorney named Susan Champion that works with Professor Romano, and that's who handled my 3 strikes case. And the transitional housing was already there. Without the ride home, I still would have made it to the transitional house. But the information that I received from the gentleman that picked me up at the gate, named Carlos Cervantes, was really vital. He told me what I could expect, good and bad, over the next few weeks, few months. And they don't just hand you a bus ticket and put you on a plane. I mean, I spent 16 hours going from Port Arthur, Texas to Evansville, Indiana, driving with someone just released from prison. And the bus ticket or the plane ride would be a lot easier, but it doesn't give you time. And with someone that's actually done it, and to give you a little encouragement, and to give you the courage to go out there and do it. And I say it in a joking way, but I was a heroin addict for 35 years. And I tell people, hey, it's not impossible. If I can do this, anybody can do it. I went to prison with a 6th grade education, no employable skills, was released without a family member in sight, straight into a transitional housing. And That's what the ride home provides. It provides a few hints and a little bit of direction, and the power of a cheerleader in your corner, that can't be overstated. Someone to tell you, hey, you can do this. This can be done. You just gotta want it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Butterfield?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me again thank the three witnesses for their powerful testimonies today. I shall never forget it. I thank you so very much. Let me spend my few moments addressing state and federal funding issues for criminal justice reform and reentry services. That's very important. And I'm going to ask you in just a moment if you would to help me understand the trend in California toward the investment in these services from your state assembly, because I don't know. But what I do know is the trend at the federal level, and it is not good. As a country, we spend $4.7 trillion every year. 2.9 trillion of that is what we call entitlement spending, which means that we don't vote on it. It is an entitlement. $2.9 trillion in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and a few other programs. They are entitlements. What remains is what is referred to as discretionary programs, which is what we do vote on yearly. In fact, we're in the middle of the appropriations process as we speak. About half of the $1.9 trillion that we have to vote on, and we'll be voting on the next few days. We have already voted on some of those budgets, voted on one yesterday, the defense budget. But of that $1.9 trillion, a half of that goes to the Pentagon. The other half goes to what we call non-defense discretionary spending. That's the pot of money that we need to target programs to criminal justice reform and reentry services. Yes, we passed the First Step Act. I'm very proud of the First Step Act. I voted for it, but it is only a first step. We must invest significant resources at the federal level. Your state assembly must invest significant resources at the local level so that we can deal with job training and traditional housing and transitional housing and GED services and legal services and health care and nutrition programs and on and on. And so what we're facing in Washington is a thing called sequestration. Several years ago during the Obama administration, we had a debt limit crisis and the Republicans put the screws on us. They would not allow us to raise the debt limit. I don't have time to develop that right now, but there had to be a grand compromise. And the grand compromise was what we commonly refer to as sequestration. It put a cap on federal spending. It put a cap on it on the defense side and the non-defense side. And so the Pentagon has felt that they have been strangled by sequestration. We in the community that support social services and the safety net feel like we have been strangled because we are not able to lift the cap and to continue to invest. And so we've had a crisis. And so now the Republicans feel that there needs to be a lifting of the cap for the defense spending. We would not agree until there was a lifting of the cap for non-defense spending. And so that's the tension that we have going right now. And so, and we're going to continue to resolve it. All of us are on the Democratic side of the aisle, and I can tell you that the Democratic budget in the House of Representatives is a budget that's not perfect, but it's a budget that all of you would be proud of if you would really take a hard look at it. The problem is once we pass our budget, it then has to go to the Senate for consideration, and there are different viewpoints over in the Senate, and there's certainly a different viewpoint down on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so we're right in the middle of a real struggle right now to get the budget right. But tell me, if you will, Ms. Burton, and I know you've been on the front line now for a long time, what is the trend line in California with respect to state investment in reentry services?
So we, Proposition Assembly Bill 109 shifted money from state prison budget into communities, and that's where communities had the come up with a formula for how they would spend that money. And so there are resources that come from the state to the counties that agencies can apply.
So there is a sensitivity in your assembly toward this issue. Maybe
Most
not where you
definitely.
want, maybe not where you want it
Not
to
enough.
be, but
Yeah.
the trend is in the right direction.
Yes.
Mr. Harold, do you agree with that or disagree?
No, I agree.
Okay, Mr. Bailey, where are you on that? In terms of state funding for reentry services?
I really don't know the statistics or the numbers. The need for it is there, and I think the numbers of recidivism will show that people that avail themselves to transitional housing have a better chance of success.
You know, we ran into a crisis a few years ago with the debt ceiling. You all remember the word debt ceiling, and that's how sequestration evolved. But we're getting ready to hit the debt ceiling again in the next few weeks, and we're going to use this debt ceiling debate to try to leverage more resources at the federal level so that programs like this can survive. Thank you so very much.
I just like to state that money comes from the state. It comes down, and sometimes it comes down through law enforcement. A lot of times it comes down through law enforcement. And then law enforcement wants you to contract with them. But they also want to implement stipulations or requirements within those contracts. That's not good for the people that you're serving. So me, as a new way of life, the director, I had to terminate some of that because we were not going to treat people the way in which they would want to, the way in which is not the best for them. The other thing is that private prisons can't come into our communities and begin to do a reentry. And that's what we see. Those are some of those resources, a lot of those resources going to. So when we say community-based, we're not talking about the private prison industry. We're not talking about all of a sudden law enforcement doing reentry. You can't be on the front end and the back end. So I just want to make those clarifications about how resources come down, how they're distributed and allocated.
Well said. Thank you.
Representative Evans.
You just heard Congressman Bellifield talk to you about the expense side. Steve and I are on the revenue side. So he talks about the expense side, we're on the revenue side. And the reason I say that, I say to you on ways and means. So when you talk about housing and transitional housing, one idea I would plant with Congresswoman Bass to think about, the low-income tax credit program is a program that tends to be funded by the federal government. And I don't know how California is structured, but in the case of Pennsylvania, there's an agency called the PHA, which is the Housing Authority. And then it gives money to the public authority. And basically where it gets all of its money from is through the tax activity bond, which is capped, which was capped when the Republicans did it on the tax side. So what the discussion Congressman Butterfield described to you is ultimately an issue about revenue. And what the Republicans was able to do is the term called sort of drain the beast, about cut the taxes so there wouldn't be any money on the expense side. Where we are right now, since we've now gotten in charge, we are having this internal debate, not among us, but about revenue and the availability about revenue. So what I would say to you, and I do agree with you, Mr. Bailey, a great deal, the housing issue is probably the issue. My understanding here in California, I heard the congressman describe, there's some kind of bond issue regarding housing. I think you did something about bond housing because of, we are faced the same kind of problem, is how do we address that? I mean, if anything is, homelessness is a huge, huge problem. And we haven't figured out what's the best way to approach that. So
you're not working with us with lived experience. You're working with the other folks who have a stake.
You can't do that now. Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
So the bottom line is what we're trying to figure out is we're trying to figure out ways to make more housing available from where we sit. We're trying to figure out what leverage, how do we put the votes together? Because I totally agree with you. You can't talk about if a person doesn't have any place to live. there is no question that is a huge issue. So I share with you that's something that we are trying. I want to go back to something that, if I can call you Big John. Absolutely. I want to go back to something you said, which I'm very much interested in. This is me, I'm interested in personally. I have an older brother who was addicted for 25 years. He's been no longer, he hasn't been addicted in the last 15 or 20 years. What I'm most interested in is the aspect of when you started this conversation off, you talked about interventions. And you talk about the life skills. What I'm most interested in is trying to understand what interventions sort of work. And is that something that's driven by government, driven by the community, driven by religion, driven by church? What exactly, because the follow-up with Congresswoman Bass, when she talks about this entity, trying to figure out, the intervention aspects. So can you talk a little bit about the life skill part that you talk about? And is that mandated? Is that done by a volunteer effort, or how do people enter that?
For me and for Second Call, it's voluntary.
Okay.
But through the community and through experiences, it is absolutely mandatory that an individual come understand these life skills before I put them out there in that savage kingdom, what we call the real world. Because if I grew up in a square mile, the only thing I understood was violence, there's no way I'm gonna get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, work 40 hours a week for 25 years. That doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
Because in my brain, I have low self-esteem. So if I got low self-esteem, one of the things that I learned by women that came out of her program was that hurt people hurt people. So when I hear someone's addicted, I don't even care about the addiction. I want to know what they're running from. And once we get that and we start that process, then we start the process of cleansing out the body, understanding what's going on. Like right now, I'll be 50 in December. And my father's the one that's left, and he lives at my property. But right to this day, it affects me because he never told me he's proud of me. But that affects me as a man. I know that I'm an absolute beast.
Yeah.
But I know as a man, that affects me. So as a young man, I couldn't go to some of my fellow gang members and say, hey, homie, I feel a little low self-esteem. It doesn't work that way. But now, as a man, I can say that and have other people sit there. So not only do we get the ones coming out, but before they go, I have children in the class that they can understand. I can talk about how I feel and how I feel about certain things. And we get it out through the experience, because I've slept in those alleys. I've ate out of trash cans. I've watched things and I know I can't unsee in my head. But at the same time, I know that the rear view mirror in my car is the smallest mirror because it ain't meant for me to look back. I gotta move forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, thank you each for speaking your truth and for sharing with us how you have overcome the challenges that you faced and how you are now giving back to help other people. This is a very valuable panel. I like to follow the money, as my colleague Mr. Evans said. Again, going back to where I started, the California Department of Corrections, last year's budget was $12 billion.
Ooh, we can do a lot with that.
It's 9% of your state budget, which is about $132 billion. If my math is right, and I know it's on average and the rate's gone up over the years, but between the amount of years each one of you have served and how much the taxpayers spent, this is a $3 million panel sitting here. What could we have done with that $3 million for these 3 individuals rather than incarcerating them?
Well, for me,
What could we be doing with the $12 billion? And not to suggest that all of that would go away, but a lot of it could. And you spoke about the industrial prison complex. I do want to highlight just a couple of achievements in my home state of Nevada one of our state legislators passed a bill to end private prisons in the state of Nevada. They are now banned in our state. We also passed legislation dealing with the sealing of records so that that process is now more streamlined and people know how to go through the process. We passed the restoration of voting rights for ex-felons so that they have the ability to change the circumstances that may have contributed them being in the situation they were in. And finally, we passed a bill to compensate those who were wrongfully convicted and to restore some justice there. So it is a lot happening at the state level, as it is here in California, and at the federal level. But I want to touch on Mr. Big John.
Mr. Big John.
So before I ever came to Congress, I ran the state's largest employment and training nonprofit in Nevada, doing a lot of the work that you talk about. And I want to touch on something that you said because it's very relevant, is the diversity or lack thereof in some of the trades. Now, IBEW is a great example, but there are some trades that don't do well.
Absolutely.
And we have done training programs for individuals with and without prior convictions, and they still don't get in. So what can be done to help improve that, number one? Mr. Bailey, you talked about that ethic that was inside of you, that when you walked by that facility with the dog out front, you saw an opportunity where some people may have said, I don't want to do that type of work. That's not for me. What was it that put that inside of you, and how can we encourage other people to take advantage of an opportunity even though it may not be the one they first saw, because you were willing to do something initially that may have been beneath you, but it now led to you having the commercial driver's license that you have, but you had to work towards it. So I'd like to ask the two of you to speak on that, please.
So I go first. For me, when I see other individuals in different trades that don't look like me, I think about the individuals who didn't get out their comfort zone. Well, for me, when I got in as an apprentice, my very first day, the guy told me he didn't like people that looked like me. I dug ditches. But here's the thing, though, I showed up every single day. If he got there at 4 o'clock, I got there at 3:30. If he got there at 3:30, I got there at 3 o'clock. There was nothing. The only words that came out of my mouth was not a problem.
So how do we help other people have that?
That's where the mentoring comes in at, because I just didn't get in and look at it for myself. I knew I had to go back to the community and help other individuals understand that, hey, once I get in, I got to give back. Oftentimes, the reason why you don't see it is because there are people who are telling people what's going on out there in the Serengeti, but they're not out there battling. I'm in the field. I know what they want out there, and I went through it, I got through it, and now I give back, and I bring other small backgrounds that to get back in, and that's so important. What are you willing to do to be uncomfortable? I think people that get complacent get lazy, and I think people that are complacent, they just do everybody a disservice, and they play victim, and no, we ain't doing that.
Mr. Bailey?
That's right. The quick answer is I didn't have a choice myself. I knew I had to make it, and I wasn't going back to jail. I wasn't going back to addiction. I had already made up my mind inside to do better with myself. Long before Prop 36 was around, when I had no chance of parole, I just wanted to do better for myself. The addiction didn't fear me. Incarceration, I wasn't afraid of. It was the people that lived under the bridge on 39th Street. When you go from 39th and Grand to USC College, the people that lived under that bridge. Because if I wasn't going to be involved in crime and I wasn't going to be involved in drugs, that was my future. So that was my reason.
That was your motivation.
Yeah, the point that you brought up earlier is that I have in-laws that are educators, and it's a great point. You spend $10,000 in the public school system to educate a child, or you can spend $75,000 a year later. My sister-in-law comes out of her own pocket to provide things in her classroom, and what a correctional officer makes a year compared to what she makes. It's crazy. And to subsidize any kind of money for a private prison is ludicrous. Anytime somebody has an incentive to fill their house, it doesn't make sense to me.
Ms. Burton.
Yes, Congresswoman Horsford. We haven't talked about the harm women incur prior to incarceration. And the study that you have, Congresswoman Bass, is part of what women talk about as far as how they've been harmed prior to incarceration, how they grow up, what's done to them, and where they land as a result of the harm. So I want to make sure that we bring into the conversation the piece on women and what they need to actually be able to come back into the community, become productive members, and reunite with children, be good moms, good parents, good employees. One of my earliest memories is driving to Camarillo State Hospital in the back seat of my mother's car, picking up my auntie's boyfriend and trying to disappear into that seat because I knew he'd harm me over the weekend. And it went on and on and on and on through my childhood. And the women who come to a new way of life, we sit in circle, speaking and healing with each other about what's been done to us. So that lands us using drugs or angry and acting out or what have you. But I just wanted to bring into this conversation the need for women to have access to therapy services, to supports to help them heal also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Madam Chair, if I could just close by saying your vision for that one-stop community center is a great vision, and one that I know we can all work to build, not just here in California, but across the country. And we can start by taking some of the federal and state appropriations. We can't just cut those budgets. We have to make sure the money gets shifted to the resources where they can produce the best results. So thank you.
Yeah, we've got the upcoming census coming out.
Yes, we do.
I hope every single one of you all will, first of all, be counted. We'll count everybody in your household, and we'll encourage those out in the streets who may be reluctant to share some information with the census to go ahead and be counted, because the $900 billion in federal revenues that flow to the streets through the state and local governments, if you only report 50% of the people who are living in the area, then you only get 50% of the money that you should be getting. If you you only get 50% of the representation in Congress. And what we have voted for in the past has been measures that bestow upon the private for-profit prison industry that's housing people down on the border, the crisis on the border.
Yeah.
Children who are don't even have toothpaste and toothbrushes, to clean up. They're sleeping in a aluminum blanket. I don't know how that keeps you warm. And sleeping on the floor, while the providers of the jail ownership, the detention facility, is getting $775 a night per child. That's obscene. So we need to be voting. Also, if everybody in here needs to be registered to vote and exercising their right to vote.
Thank you. Well, let me wrap us up here, and let me begin by really thanking everybody that turned out today. This is an amazing outpouring. It shows how important this issue is, and since So many people have my phone number, I get text messages from people in this room. I just wanted to mention that the Anti-Recidivism Coalition is a one-stop for reentry, and that 64% of the staff at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition are formerly incarcerated, and they provide comprehensive case management and pathways to careers, housing, and policy advocacy. I mention that because there are already a lot of examples of work that is taking place every day. There's Big John, there's a new way of life, but I know there's many people in this room who've been involved in this fight to end mass incarceration for decades. Many of us have been working on this issue for a very long time. We saw the laws when they were being passed. We tried to fight them, we lost, but now we're in a time period in our history where we're taking a look at this. And I will tell you that everybody on the panel today are Democrats, but you should know that this is a bipartisan issue. A couple of my Republican colleagues who wanted to come just were not able to come scheduling-wise. But you should know that we do work together on this issue. But the difference is that since there was a change in Congress, we're now here. This is top on our agenda in the Congressional Black Caucus, in the Democratic Caucus, on the subcommittee, and on Judiciary Committee, reforming our criminal justice system, ending and reversing mass incarceration are keys to our platform. I want to thank the staff from the Congressional Office who worked very hard in putting this together, and I want to thank the staff from the Judiciary Committee. You should raise your hand because you flew here from Washington, D.C. You see Joe, Janice from Washington, D.C. We flew here to put this on. And then, you know, I want to thank my colleagues that are here. You know, those of you that know me, when you see me come home on the weekends, you always tell me how sorry you are that I have to go back to D.C. And I always tell you that there's no place else I would rather be than at the center of the fight, the existential fight that we are doing in our country right now. But one of the big reasons, too, is that I get to serve with people like the people who are on this panel. And several of them, I mean, Ted and I are from Los Angeles. We're used to 4 days in DC, 3 days in LA. We live on United Airlines and a couple of other carriers we spend 10 hours a week on. But my other colleagues that are here had a choice to make. They could have gone home. Now, we all have to be back to work on Monday. They could have gone home, but instead they flew to Los Angeles, and now we'll go home for maybe 1 day, a few hours, and then head right back to DC. But these are the type of people that I get to work with every day, which is why I can survive being in DC. As Susan mentioned the need to address women, I mentioned at the beginning that on Tuesday in Washington, D.C., we will have a full hearing that looks at why women are involved in the criminal justice system to begin with, what happens to them when they're there, what do they need when they leave. I'm doing specific legislation on pregnancy while incarcerated. So we have an awful lot of work to do. But one of the things that we have to figure out is the fact that this has become an industry, and so many people profit off of this in so many ways. The whole re-entry idea that now the corporations are looking at how they take over re-entry, because we have so many barriers of people who are formerly incarcerated, that's why I believe we need programs that are led by people who are formerly incarcerated, because it serves as a source of support, but also as a source of employment. The young woman that mentioned working with people with lived experience, a basic principle that I have and many of my other colleagues have is that the best way to do legislation is not to go off in some ivory tower, but to talk to people who have experienced it and to have them participate with you while you are developing the legislation. My colleague, Representative Johnson, mentioned the census, and the census is an issue that I know our colleagues are going to address in the state legislature, Because you know, one other thing that mass incarceration has done to us is where are you counted when you are incarcerated? You are counted where you are incarcerated, but you know that 30% of the state's prisoners come back to Los Angeles County, which cheats us of resources if they are counted in areas that they do not live on. So we have a big agenda ahead of us. I have confidence that we will be able to continue to pass legislation on criminal justice reform. We have one of these little openings where there is interest in the Senate and there is interest in the administration. So we're going to get it done, and I just want to thank you so much for devoting your Saturday morning to address such a critical issue in our country. Thank you, and we are adjourned.